Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ODI Fridays lunchtime lecture. My name's Ellen. I'm head of policy here at the Open Data Institute. Just some really quick housekeeping before we begin. There is a hashtag for anyone who is following this on Twitter. It's hashtag ODI Fridays. This is also live streamed and recorded, so just bear that in mind during the questions phase, because questions you ask will be captured in the live stream and recording, so we just want to make sure that's clear before we start. We host a range of lunchtime lectures over the course of the year. Almost every Friday it's a different subject. I'm really personally excited about today's lunchtime lecture from Woodrow about open data. What does it mean, and what does it mean in the context of privacy? Because this is something that we think about a lot at the Open Data Institute, because this tension between open and privacy is one that we encounter almost on a weekly basis, this sense that they're binary opposites, that never the twain shall meet. So I'm really interested to see what Woodrow works through in terms of the spectrum between open and privacy as they're kind of commonly described. I think that's it for housekeeping. There will be questions. We'll all have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I realized as I prepared the slides for today that it may have exhibited a great deal of hubris to come talk to the Open Data Institute about what open data is, because this is something that you think about all day long. So I want to start off by saying that today I don't want to presume to tell you what open data is. Rather, I'd like to pose a question about a possible alternative interpretations, or maybe just solidifying what the definition of open data is and what it means with respect to privacy. And so for that matter, I'm going to really rely on you all to inform me during the Q&A period about what I got wrong and whether I'm even remotely close about what I'd like to suggest today. So I want to talk today about a friction that is probably all too familiar with everyone at ODI and anyone that works with data and open data initiatives. And that is the friction between privacy and utility in data sets. The conventional wisdom, particularly, I give several talks about this, and the wisdom that I run into in a lot of these talks is that the greater privacy people have in data sets, right, the more protected it is, then the less useful the data is, right, and they're almost proportionate to each other. And that you might as well give up on having any real utility if you want privacy, and vice versa. Now, I want to try to apply this sort of general debates to the talk of anonymization, which is what I've been working in for the past couple of years. And I want to make the proposition that whether these two values conflict, which I think it's questionable that they do, though there may be some truth to this data, depends upon how we define the notions of privacy and how we define the notions of utility. And I want to talk about that with particular respect today to anonymization. So I really want to make three major points today, and I'm going to spend the rest of my talk sort of running down these 3 points. One, the failure of anonymization has pit privacy against open data. I think probably needlessly. 2, this is only a problem if open data is thought of in absolute terms, which is where we're going to get to when I start talking about what is open data anyway. And then the final point, the normative point that I want to make, is that open data definitions should accommodate some kind of moderate risk mitigation obligations in order to make the concept of open data more sustainable and appealing to policymakers, regulators, and the general public. Okay, so what do I mean by all this? So a few years ago, I started researching anonymization, the notion of anonymization. And for years, a long time ago, now I guess, it was widely believed that as long as data sets were anonymized, then they didn't pose a risk to anyone's privacy. That as long as they didn't reveal the identity of the data subjects, then these data sets were safe to use, right? That they're safe, and you can sort of trade them, you can give them away, and things that we value in open data. anonymized data sets were good for that. And then starting, I guess it was around 10 years ago, maybe a little more than that, the protection offered by anonymization seemingly started to crumble. There were data scientists, there were security researchers who were able to demonstrate what we call re-identification attacks. They were able to take a data set and through some clever sort of re-engineering principles, they were able to identify to a certain degree of confidence percentages of people that were supposedly anonymized, right? So in 2006, America Online famously published a sample of its search queries, and although AOL replaced the screen names with random numbers in the published search logs, this minimal step did not protect its users, and people were able to re-identify the people in the supposedly anonymized data sets. The New York Times discovered and revealed the identity of a 62-year-old AOL customer in the data set, Thelma Arnold, and they were able to publish her search queries. And so you can imagine if someone was able to re-identify your search queries, that can reveal a relatively great deal about you. There were lots of other sort of high-profile re-identification attacks that have been made public over the past few years. And so this failure of anonymization, this sort of seemingly relatively bulletproof approach is now starting to crumble, and everyone's like, oh, well, anonymization doesn't work anymore. That means we have to expand what our definition of personal information is, because things that are supposedly identified might be identifiable, right? This is the sort of terminology that we use. And this failure of anonymization, at least as from my perspective in the United States, really took hold in the mind of regulators, right? So regulators read a lot of these studies, and these papers that came out were incredibly influential. And the regulator said, well, wait a second, just because something is anonymized doesn't mean that it's protected. And it gave people great hesitation. And so it caused people to sort of regulators and the general public, actually, because I know that something has sort of hit the zeitgeist when my mom calls me and said, you know that all those taxi cab drivers were able to be identified. And so when my mom is telling me that anonymization has failed, then I truly know that anonymization has got some real problems. And the biggest culprits of anonymization's failure is what a scholar named Paul Ohm calls release and forget data sets. And these are data sets that were de-identified in some way. He uses the term scrubbed, right? So you take someone's name, you replace them with identifiers, you delete the address, and you put only their city or maybe their zip code in the United States. And so there are ways by which you can sort of scrub data, and then you release it out into the world as anonymized, right? And this is what he calls release and forget. And you assume that the protection is probably good enough, and then the researchers get a hold of it, and they say that, well, it's not good enough. And with almost every major re-identification attack that's been demonstrated, which is usually a sort of proof of concept by data researchers, it has almost always been with release and forget style anonymization. And it is this release and forget anonymization that I think has done a lot of the framing work in pitting privacy against data utility. Because in order to make a release and forget data set really truly anonymized, meaning that it's got sufficiently low enough risk that we feel pretty confident that no one's ever going to re-identify it, you've got to scrub that data pretty good, right? You've got to strip that data of a lot of really nuanced, fine-grained detail. And to anyone that works in data science, that's a bad thing, because you're losing a lot of really valuable pieces of information. And so I think that release and forget data is one of the real birthplaces of this sort of framing where we say, well, you can have useful data or you can have privacy protective data, but you can't have both kinds of data. And I think that release and forget data is a threat to the concept of open data. And the reason why is because if people start to equate release and forget data with open data, then open data is going to seem risky from a privacy perspective, because we know that release and forget anonymization is not that good, right? There are ways to anonymize that are really good, that lower risk, but it's largely not through release and forget data. And so I want to talk about this sort of framing, right? And I think we can avoid the problem of release and forget data with equating it with openness, because we only run into the problem of this framing, this adversarial framing, if we define and we equate openness with complete freedom. Now, when I say complete freedom, I mean to articulate a sort of absolute position that imposes no legal obligation and virtually no transaction cost to using data, right? So if this framing of openness is something I think we need to care more about, which leads us, I think, to a relatively interesting question, which is what is open data in the first place? So for the past 3 or 4 months, I've been digging around trying to find some definitions of open data. Because open data, like privacy, like anonymization, like a lot of terms that we use in public spheres, is one of these terms that I think we intuitively think we know what it means. But when you actually start to sort of drill down what it means, you get a lot of different definitions. So on day 1 of my privacy course, I teach information privacy law in the United States at a law school. I have all of my students give me their definition of privacy. And as you can imagine, I have 12 students. I get 12 totally complete different answers. And it turned out that that's the case for a lot of terms. And when I started digging into open data, I found several different sorts of conceptualizations. And so I want to propose today that it's time that we start thinking really hard about finding some precise definitions about what we mean when we say the term open data. And this matters, maybe not for a lot of different things, but it does matter for regulators, and it matters for the general public. And so I think that the point that I want to make here is that framing matters, right? We know that the way that something is presented, the way an issue is presented, the way an event is presented, can produce significant changes of opinion. This isn't just some sort of theory. This is sort of proven empirically in a lot of disciplines, right? So psychological disciplines have done a lot of study on framing. We know that people are more willing to tolerate rallies by controversial hate groups in the United States when the rallies are framed as free speech issues rather than when these rallies are framed as disruptions of public order. They can be both, right? Something that disrupts the public order can be a free speech issue. But if you frame a hate speech rally as a free speech issue, then we know people are much more willing to tolerate it, right? Just based almost completely on the way you frame it. And so one of the most examples with respect to privacy, with respect to framing, is the nothing to hide argument. Has anyone here heard what's the nothing to hide argument? Audience participation time. Who's heard the nothing to hide argument?
Well, if you don't have anything to hide, it shouldn't be worried.
That's right. So surveillance is often justified with the nothing to hide argument, right? Which is, why do you care that someone's spying on you? Do you have something to hide, right? And this argument only works when you frame privacy as the hiding of things, right? In terms of secrecy, right? So if hiding is secrecy, then maybe the nothing to hide argument works. But of course, I would argue that secrecy is only one very small little part of privacy, right? And that when you conceptualize privacy in different ways, so perhaps privacy as trust, privacy as dignity, privacy as autonomy, right? Lots of different privacy as control, which is the dominant paradigm in lots of different privacy regimes, then the nothing to hide argument crumbles completely, right? Based entirely on the framing. And so framing matters, and the way we talk about privacy and the way we talk about data matters in terms of policy, and it matters in terms of norms. And so I started digging into a lot of the different definitions, and some of what I want to do today is just sort of take a tour on what I found. And I would love to know if I missed any major definitions, because I'm compiling this for a research project. So obviously I started with the ODI, and I think that ODI probably has one of the most nuanced definitions of open data that I've seen in terms of creating the spectrum, right, which I found to be incredibly useful. Now, as far as an actual definition of open data goes, I dug around a little and I couldn't find a very precise definition other than open data is data that anyone can access, use, or share. Simple as that, right? So even within that are embedded certain sort of assumptions, right, which I want to unpack a little bit later. But note that if you look at things like license that limits use, right, one of the things I want to call attention to in this definition, even though I love this spectrum, is that that's less than open on this spectrum, right? I want to put a pin in that and just note that open here is framed in sort of almost absolute terms, right? So the gold standard of data is framed in sort of absolute terms. And then the more restrictions there are, right, or the more sort of protective it is, then the less open it becomes, and it heads closer towards the closed end of the spectrum. And so I want to revisit some of that. Some of the other definitions I found, so open knowledge has an interesting definition. They say a piece of content or data is open if you are free to use, reuse, and redistribute it, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and share alike. This is an interesting conceptualization of data. Note that no privacy protections are mentioned in this definition of openness, right? So we don't talk about privacy doesn't sort of pop up anywhere in this openness definition, at least not explicitly, but there was a restriction placed in the open data, which I thought was really interesting. They say subject at most to the requirement to attribute and share alike. That sort of implies the existence of some sort of agreement. I want to put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it. Melanie Chernoff, the public policy manager for Red Hat, said that generally open data means that data should be released in a format that is free of royalties and other IP restrictions. And so then she draws a distinction between just the fact that something is available does not mean that it's open. Now, this definition was primarily concerned with financial transaction costs, right? Whether it actually costs money to access data, not data protection responsibilities. Another definition that I found was the open definition. And the open definition says the open means anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose, subject at most, here's another caveat to the open data definition, to requirements that preserve provenance and openness. Put most succinctly, open data and content can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. Again, no real mention of privacy or any kind of data protection in that definition. It more was a sort of property mindset, right? Is there some sort of propertization that allows someone to charge or license use? The Open Data Handbook. Open Data Handbook provides that open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone. If you'll notice, there's a pattern that's sort of emerging here from open data definitions. At most, to the subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and share alike. Again, another sort of property-like requirement built into the definition of open data. The full open definition gives precise details as to what this means, and I'll briefly summarize the most important. There are really three different sort of tenets of open data within the Open Data Handbook. Availability and access is one of them, that the data must be available as a whole and no more than a reasonable reproduction cost, preferably downloading over the internet, so that's how we access the data. The data must also be available in convenient and modifiable form. That's the format of the data. I think what we're getting to there is machine readable is better than in sort of, unscanned PDF that OCR wouldn't work on. Reuse and redistribution was the second tenet. The data must be provided under terms that permit reuse and redistribution, including intermixing with other data sets. So what can I do with this data beyond just the format? And then universal participation is the final tenet. Everyone must be able to use, reuse, and redistribute, and there should be no discrimination against fields of endeavor against persons or groups, right? So this is a no wrongful discrimination sort of clause. And make sure that everyone can use it. Again, note here that open data can include some restrictions, notably attribution and share alike, which is important to my later point. All right, the Open Data Barometer. I found a definition here, and they define open data. They say, open data is data which is freely available and shareable online without charge. Again, note that this is a sort of property-based mindset with regard to open data. They're concerned about making it free. And when I say free of cost, I mean free of financial cost, right? That's really what open data, this definition of open data, is focusing on. And then there are two scholars that work at an organization called Upturn. These two scholars, Harlan and Yu, they say open has two different components, right? So there's a technological component to openness. And technological components suggest that computers can handle the information efficiently. This deals with the format of data, right? We need it to be computer processable in order to really be open. And then they say there's a philosophical component to open data. And the philosophical component is one that allows all people who might benefit from the information to be able to share and reuse it in a democratized and accessible way. Really, what the philosophical component gets at is the absence of legal barriers to the use of data. Another definition for open data that I found is that the NYU's GovLab, and so Joel Gurin, who's a senior advisor to the governance lab at NYU and former editorial editor and executive vice president of the Consumers Union, defined open data as intentionally released government data, intentionally released for public use. In other words, accessible public data that people, companies, and organizations can use to launch new ventures, analyze patterns and trends, and make data-driven decisions. So this definition sort of targets an intentional release, right? So if you intentionally release it for public use, then it's open. I don't know if that captures everything that we've seen in other definitions of public data, but it's just a different definition that I found. So what can we get from all this? What is open data anyway? I tried to distill down a sort of common set of concerns or attributes of open data. And what I got at were really some questions. Or anyone that might benefit from the data? What kind of licensing credentials are there? What kind of authentication credentials are there? Is there any discrimination between people or groups? Right? So the less discrimination, the more open it is. The more people that can use it, the more open it is. And then, of course, the less open it is. Cost of access was the second thing that I noticed. And we saw this come up in a lot of the definitions that I just went through. Is it free financially? Does anyone have to pay for it? Obviously, the freer it is, the more open it is. The format of the data. Is it machine readable? Is it somehow otherwise processable? Can you put OCR on it, for example? Permitted uses. Are you allowed to edit the data any way you want? Are you allowed to ask anything of the data? In other words, are there certain questions that you're not allowed to ask of the data? Can you commercially exploit the data? Right? So if there are restrictions on commercial exploitation, then some people might say, well, that's not open data. Can you combine it with other data sets? Right? Must you keep it sort of siloed off, or can you really combine it to get more powerful insights by combining it with other data sets? 5, permitted disclosures. Who can you give it to? Who can you share it with? Can you share it with anyone? Can you share it if they agree? And this is incredibly important to where I'm headed. If you'll notice that some of the requirements that were allowed under the definition of open data were what they called share-alike licenses. What's a share-alike license?
Yeah, the term comes from Creative Commons licenses, so it's you share it with somebody else under the same terms as the license that's provided to you under.
Exactly. It forms sort of a chain, right? A protective chain. And often this is attribution, right? So that's what we see. It's like attribution combined with share-alike, right? Or non-commercial.
I mean, if you tried to combine a share-alike, like if you tried to combine a attribution share-alike license with an attribution non-commercial license, you would have an incompatible end result.
Oh, right.
Because the share-alike license is like, you have to share it under the same terms as this license,
Right.
which means you would be overriding the non-commercial aspects of the other license, which doesn't have a share-alike
Right.
section.
There are lots of conflicts, right? But this is part of what we sort of say is possibly compatible with open data, though, right? I mean, we say subject to, at most, either a share-alike license or a non-commercial.
Yeah.
Not non-commercial. Right. And so the share-alike sort of creates a chain, right? You have to take it on the same terms that I took it upon, and as long as you agree to that, then you can have this data. And so what all of this boils down to, in my mind, are concerns about transaction costs. How difficult is it to access the data, right? And to use the data and to share the data, and legal prohibitions, right? Am I allowed to do this with the data, or am I prohibited from doing this with the sort of the data? And that's, I welcome any sort of feedback on that. Okay, and so that was my second point. What is open data? I think those are the factors that we can sort of derive from, that some combination of those factors that's what our universe of open data that we're talking about is. And so the third point that I want to make here is that in order for data to be sustainable, open data to be sustainable, it has to be seen as safe, right? If the concept of open data becomes synonymous in the eyes of regulators and the eyes of the general public as risky, then that jeopardizes the movement's flourishing, right? People say, well, open data, I don't know. People can re-identify anything these days, you know, right? And that is a hindrance to this concept. And so one of the things that I want to argue is against an absolute framing of open data in order to preserve its sustainability as a concept. I want to make the argument that some restrictions that protect privacy can preserve utility and still live on in the spirit of what we've seen as the sort of major factors of open data. When you categorize open data as protected but still useful data as somehow less than open, right? So I want to go back to the ODI slide, right? When you, sorry, I don't mean to give everyone whiplash. I'm headed back here. When you categorize this forward as something less than open, right, as sort of the gold standard, then you're implying that the only kind of data that's fit for the gold standard, truly open data, might be one that leaves people at risk, right? That's where our privacy versus utility comes into play. And so I want to propose that this needlessly pits two concepts, privacy and openness, against each other, particularly when I think that a lot of our concerns about what is really open are financially based, whether you charge money or not, and not necessarily restrictive of or about placing obligations on privacy. So everyone close your eyes while I swing you back through the, I apologize. Okay, so I want to argue that data subject to minimum obligations minimum obligations to protect the data, and I apologize for my grammar there, I realize that's pretty horrific, can still be thought of as open, particularly data that is aimed at things like prohibitions on re-identification, for example, because that's what a lot of people are concerned about, particularly with the anonymization. People are concerned about a lot of the talk that we have in the data security community. So I do a lot of data security research. We talk about adversaries, right? Who are our adversaries? People who will want to get data and exploit it for adversarial use. And a lot of that adversarial use involves re-identification. These re-identification attacks stir everyone's imagination, right? So when that AOL story was published, and you were able to Netflix did this too. So did everyone read about the Netflix study where they published it online and then some computer scientists got a hold of it and they say, ooh, we can tell what everyone's viewing data is, right? Then that immediately sort of strikes fear into the heart of people that someone's going to take their data set, right, your Google profile or your Netflix profile, and figure out who it was that you actually were, right? Right. Well, that's hard, right? Because a lot of this has to do with threat modeling, right? Like, what do we choose as our threat model, and how do we define our data? I think there's a way for us to accommodate lots of different possible threats in a nuanced way without sort of predefining like what any one particular danger is, which I hopefully will get to in a second. And so I want to make a possibly, I don't know whether this is controversial or not, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that defining open data in a safe and sustainable way means distancing open data from release and forget data sets, right? Meaning that we might have to consider some kind of obligation, either through a Creative Commons-like contractual obligation, perhaps at a minimum, to do things like not re-identify, can still be truly open data, right? Can still be the gold standard for data, which requires maybe tweaking a little bit our definition of what open data is. And before we get into the debate about whether we need to distance open data or at least somehow distinguish open data from release and forget data sets, I'd like for, and I really mean this as particularly in the Q&A session, to sort of dig into this a little, let's ask ourselves if get data sets are worth defending. And if that's true, I would love to hear the reasons why. We sign a licensing agreement for literally almost every single internet transaction we make, right? So you log on to any website. I noticed in the EU, the cookie message pops up, right? And we agree, I agree to allow the use of cookies, right? We sign a licensing agreement for virtually everything we do online, right? And I wonder if we have some terms, some basic terms that don't decrease the utility of data. And talking with data scientists, requirements not to try and re-identify the data seem to be relatively uncontroversial among, so I sat on my university's IRB, for example. Most people say, we don't want to re-identify the data, we just want to glean some insights from the data, right? So re-identification is seen as sort of separate from utility, because most people, when they get data sets, don't want to re-identify someone if they've been anonymized. And so maybe basic requirements not to re-identify can be a part of the definition of open data. The law sort of acts as a backstop on data use for every single subject, right? So true sort of, pure libertarian open data doesn't even exist anyway, because we're all subject to the provisions of the GDPR, the EU Data Directive, or whatever privacy regime that it is, right? So we can never achieve sort of pure open data nirvana, and I don't even think we would want it if we had it, right? Because we have things of concerns like privacy. And so I want to throw out there that maybe release and forget data sets aren't worth defending. And if that's the case, then we can safely sort of re-identify open data to incorporate minimal data privacy and data protections. I say that can fit within an open data regime. Okay, in order for this to work, we also, and this is what a lot of my research previous today has been on, we also have to change the way we think about anonymization. We have to reshape notions of anonymization to mean low risk. One of the reasons that people were shocked about the failure of anonymization is that they thought it was foolproof, right? That it was a guarantee of anonymization. The re-identification attacks that occur only show that with a certain piece of auxiliary information that you're able to re-identify in a very small percentage of the chances. But a lot of and this is why framing matters, a lot of the re-identification attacks are almost completely guaranteed never to happen in the real world, because the percentage of the likelihood of it happening is so low, right? You have to have this certain kind of piece of information combined with this certain kind of expertise to work in this certain kind of way, and only for this one particular data set, right? And the odds of all of that sort of coming together in an adversary that's got the motivation to de-identify is very low, right? Because a lot of hackers, they don't care which database they break as long as they can break one. So if it's relatively de-identified, they'll just move on to a different data set, right? Or it's not financially valuable to de-identify, and so they're not going to waste a lot of efforts. This is part of threat modeling, right? But that's not what we read when we log on to The Guardian and we see that AOL were these search engines that people could figure out who you were, right? Because then everyone has a heart attack and everyone says, well, no, don't release any data anymore. Instead, we have to rethink of anonymization in process terms. So what I've argued is that anonymization should be thought of as the process of minimizing risk, just like data security. So the law of data security doesn't guarantee that information is safe, right? Because we never can. If someone wants to hack you, you are going to get hacked. That's almost a guarantee, right? I mean, there's just almost no way to completely prevent something. So what do we do instead? We say, well, there are certain steps that you have to follow to lower the risk of this data being compromised, right? You have to implement technical safeguards. You have to implement procedural safeguards. You have to implement administrative safeguards. And if you do those things, you're in compliance with the law, even if you get hacked, right? That's the way that data security law works. We have to start thinking of anonymization in the same way. You have to follow certain kinds of steps, and if you follow those certain kind of steps with good threat modeling, we know what lowers the risk of de-identification. And if the risk of de-identification is lowered enough through these steps, it should be good enough. Will some people be re-identified? Possibly, right? In the same way that some people will possibly be hacked through data security. Hacks happen all the time. But from a matter of policy, we have to start thinking in terms of risk management, is the name of the game, in my opinion, for anonymization and for data security. This is not going to solve all problems, but it can solve some problems. And one of the ways that we can mitigate this risk is through share-alike contracts, right? Is it going to solve everything? No. Some people might violate their share-alike agreement. But it does put the normative heft of the law behind things, right? So most people, when they get data sets, they want to follow the law, right? Most people comply with the law. Most organizations comply with the law. And so if they know that they're under an obligation not to re-identify, then that should serve as some sort of mitigating factor. And so these sorts of protections, right, protections not to re-identify, maybe basic sort of process-based steps that recipients of open data have to go through, maybe just basic data security, right? Don't store the data in an unencrypted form. That's pretty simple, right? Some basic sort of obligations that you have to undertake should still not make data less than open, right? That we should be able to say this is open data, even though there are minimal requirements to protect privacy. And I think that we can do that in a way that still preserves those main factors that I went through, those 1 through 5. We can still keep it free. We can still make it non-discriminatory, right? It's anyone that agrees to the basic requirements gets the open data. I think that should be seen as sort of permissive. And so all of that to say, I think that if we rethink about the way we define open data in a way that makes it protective of privacy in at least a minimal way and respects anonymization as sort of a risk management technique, then we can make the concept sustainable for the long term. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to go into Q&A from here.
Thank you very much, Woodrow. I know that I'm thinking lots of things as a result. I can see someone already has their hand up. So did you want to start off? Can you introduce yourself? And I'm going to give you the microphone before I forget.
Hi, my name is Karolis. I'm the ODI associate here. I'm thinking about legal definitions, and that's a very interesting conversation to have. My question is, where a perfect definition of open data should find its place. That's one thing. But another concern that I have is the culture of open data organizations. And there is an organization called Responsible Data Forum that deals with open data, responsible data policies. And my guess is that in the near future, every organization dealing with open data will have a responsible data policy. And there's probably a connection between the culture of our community and probably legal follow-up to follow, right? So my question is, have you been doing any thinking about the culture of the community and whether there should be a shift in kind of perception of what is open and if open by default is really the idea worth defending, in your words?
I think that's a great question. I haven't thought about the culture of the open data community, but it's one that I think is going to be important because one of the things that I would argue for in thinking about policy, so if a policymaker sort of comes and says, okay, genius, what should we make open data be defined as? One of the reasons I would encourage redefining open data and thinking hard about it is one of the things that I would recommend is looking to industry standards, right, or community standards. Data security law does this relatively well because what I'm arguing is largely modeling data protection law and anonymization off data security law. Data security law looks to industry standards. They look to things like the NIST framework. They look to the ISO frameworks. The open data community has an opportunity to get ahead of the game right now and define open data in a sustainable way and providing a framework for regulators to look to, because regulators would frankly, at least in my experience, prefer it if you had a framework already created where they could say, just do what everyone else is doing, right? Just do the industry standard that we think is safe and protective. Then they'll just say reasonable anonymization includes following the open data protective framework, right? Created by, was this the responsible open data policies? Maybe that's a framework that could actually be implemented into policy. And in that case, then the culture of the open data community matters very specifically to data protection policy.
I'll go to Kieran first and go back, down the back of the room that way.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the talk. Kieran O'Hara of the University of Southampton. Um, I agree with every point you make. I'm absolutely right. And release and forget is not sustainable. The issue, one issue, which I don't know whether you've taken into account, is one of cost. Because I remember when open data was sort of becoming more of a norm around about 2010, 2011, there was a lot of effort and bureaucratic tug of war about developing an open government license. And that was, and that has come in a way to kind of define openness, at least in the UK context. It may be different in the States. And the definition of that open government license took a lot of doing and a lot of head scratching. And the implication, I think, of your proposal, which I'm very, very sympathetic to, is that actually every single, so for government data, every single department is going to have to think of its own license based on the qualities of the data and not on the qualities of the transaction, which is what the OGL defines. So there's a cost associated with this, a bureaucratic cost that in the government context may not be sustainable. What do you think about that?
This is where I would want to talk to a lot of experts to see whether it would work or not. Because data security, again, not to sound like a broken record, but data security law works in a sort of similar way here in that there is no one right way to do data security. Now, this frustrates a lot of companies and a lot of regulators who, frankly, would rather have a lockstep approach to protecting, to securing data. Right, so I work with a lot of companies that say, okay, give me step 1 through 10 on how to comply with data security law. And you simply can't answer it. Right? If you can have your checklist, right? A low-cost checklist to protect data, or you can have good data security, but you can't have both, right? And it may simply be a matter of coming to terms with the fact that we need to identify good enough sort of standards, right? And have open-ended standards. This sort of helps. When you define something in a way where you say just have reasonable data protection, right? That's head scratch. I mean, it's infuriating for anyone that's actually implementing it, but it's something that works a lot as a legal standard, because then we say just use your best judgment, right? And we defer to the judgment of each individual organization. And as long as you sort of made a good faith attempt based on industry standards, which maybe open data community could help provide, then maybe that's close. And maybe it's costly initially, but once you sort of get in, once you have industry standards to follow, then maybe that lowers the cost over time. But it may just be that it's costly if we want to do it right.
Before we go to more questions, I've just been thinking through in my head, because it's been really interesting listening, because as soon as I saw you working through the definitions of open and open data, I thought the reason a lot of those terms exist in the definitions is because in the UK at least, open does have a very technical definition, which is that unless you have a license on your data that explicitly allows people to do these things with it, companies, other public sector departments, etc., would be in breach of copyright and database right laws using that data. So part of the reason the language used in the definition is so property rights based is because your access to and use is governed by both property rights and database rights, and by the rights of a data subject and your obligations as a controller and a processor under data protection laws. And the thing that I get nervous about is when we try and put those together into one system, where I think, so the training that we try and provide, because I nodded vigorously about everything you were saying about release and forget data, because not only is it risky from a personal data perspective, but also if a department, if an organization, if a business is releasing data and then forgetting about it, it's probably not that useful anyway.
Right.
Like, for someone to use and build services off, it's like, why are you putting it out there? Because if you're not using it, how useful is it going to be for others?
Right.
But these things, what we try and help people understand is how your rights and obligations as a data controller, as a processor, have to enable you to determine when it is safe to publish data as open data, because your rights as a data subject do have primacy over rights in copyright and database law.
Right.
But the thing that I think I get a bit worried about is when we kind of say we need to change the definition, when I know that in no small way in the UK that definition of open comes from open access, open source, which is very explicitly about licensing. And I'm like, how do we reconcile those?
Right.
How would you reconcile them?
Because you're right, it is so property based, and it's difficult to sort of tack that on. And maybe it's worth sort of thinking about adding a separate and distinct sort of element that doesn't then muddle the current existing definitions of open data, but then adds, I mean, sustainability is a word that I've been using. The sustainability sort of implies within it protective, right? Not risky, or at least not too risky, right? Everything, walking out of your house in the morning entails risk, but not overly risky. And so maybe there's sort of a secondary component that can be put into that. And we see, and a lot of what I've wanted to, and maybe the point I didn't make too clearly, is that we have a lot of this existing responsible data use already embedded, but we're not putting it in the definition of open data. And I think that's a missed opportunity, because a lot of open data principles are protective and they are sustainable, right? So you work a lot of different ways. Why don't we put that into the framing of it? Because framing matters. The way we talk about data matters. And if it's seen as sustainable and distinct from release and forget, then we don't even have to fight the anonymization battle with respect to open data, because it's built into the sort of framework about it. And a lot of this, some of the research I've done is on genomic data. And if you look at some of the data that comes from genomic data to download it, there is a sort of very basic license that you have to agree to. And if there's just a sort of, if we're licensing already, I don't think it detracts a lot of way from the utility of data to have very basic sort of no re-identification or some sort of basic non-discriminatory authentication. I realize that's sort of redundant, but you can have authentication that applies to everyone that says yes, right? Not based on a particular researcher.
Yeah. Alessandro Mantelero, Polytechnical University in Turin. I have 3 questions. The first one is you point out the chance to use a sort of contractual limitation regarding the re-identification. That is a well-known strategy. The problem is, and the question is, how you can enforce this kind of obligation. Because if you spread a lot of data set around, it's not so easy to know if someone has broken this obligation. Second question. A problem that you should also consider, I think, is see not the open data set as an autonomous silos, but consider the effect of the reuse or the fusion of the different data sets. In this case, in many cases, we have a sort of voluntary re-identification. So each single silos is quite anonymized. But when we merge different kind of silos, involuntary in many cases, we show enough information that make possible re-identification. And the third point is, I think that is related to the previous point. I think that the key element is not only the anonymization or identification open data. Because in many projects in which I was involved about open data, the main problem is how you can anonymize data, maintaining enough value in information. This is another point that should be considered, because if we talk in theoretical terms, we talk about anonymization and open data, and they can also coexist. They can also coexist. But the main problem is that when we talk with the guys that want, on the administration, that want to put out the data set, they said if I increase the level of anonymization, I lose a lot of content, I lose a lot of potential useful information for use, etc. So this is another point that we should consider in this balance, in concrete, in the specific case in which we are to apply these rules. Thanks.
Right. So I'll start with your third point and then work backwards if I can. So I think that when we talk about anonymizing data losing value, what we're really talking about is actually changing the data sets, right? I mean, what we mean is we're taking valuable pieces of names, some sort of particular sort of marker that lets you get someone's identity. That's only one sort of way to protect data sets, right? And there are lots of, so there's a whole field of study, statistical disclosure limitation study, that involves several different sorts of techniques that don't necessarily involve changing the data itself. One of them is the trusted researcher model. One of them is like differential privacy, for example, where you can sort of access the database through queries by injecting certain amounts of noise that make sure that you can't tell whether any one person is in the data set or not. And so a lot of my research on anonymization has been an attempt to have a holistic approach to anonymization and think of ways in which we can pair non-utility degrading anonymization or protection, right? Because trusted researcher model doesn't necessarily mean anonymization. It just means that the data subject trusts whoever is going through the data, right? Which trust is an incredibly important point that is often really undervalued in our privacy policy right now because we leverage everything on control, right? Which I think is a whole different conversation, which I'm happy to have later. But I think we should invest in trust more, right? So trusted research models can still be compatible, I think, with open data as long as you're willing to preserve the trust that you're given, right? So we can not discriminate, we can not charge, we can make it machine readable, all these open data principles, but only the people that agree to preserve the trust get the data. Now that's a limitation, right? But it's one that might allow us to use more data in a more useful way. And so I'm sort of let a thousand flowers bloom kind of guy when it comes to protecting data and privacy. And so that's one example. Your second question is involuntary re-identification, where you sort of combine everything. This is hard. You're right. The more data you accumulate together, the higher the odds come. As I understand obligations not to re-identify, what we really care about is doing anything to purposefully uncover someone's identity, right? You just don't ask the question. Now, will some people be accidentally re-identified when you come through? Possibly. Maybe when you combine, oh, so-and-so lives at this address, like I know this person, right? But that we also need to become a little more comfortable with the idea of some collateral damage with using data. Data security has it, right? If we wanted perfect data security, we would not allow data to be stored on a hard drive, full stop. Right? In the same way that if we wanted everyone to live using cars, we would ban cars. Right? If we really cared about making car safety 100%, we would ban the use of cars. But we don't do that, right? Because we have too much utility from cars. In the same way, we need to get sort of comfortable with what are acceptable risk thresholds for the use of data. And if we start talking about acceptable risk thresholds, then we can really start pushing the ball. And it may vary, according to appetite. And then finally, how do we check with this? This is the biggest problem about comparing data anonymization to data security. We know, more or less, when data has been breached. It is very difficult to know when data has been re-identified, right? Because there's no sort of external marker that we get. The best answer I have with that is we can check things like procedures to de-identify through auditing processes, right? Like, did you go through the process to sort of protect data? Do you have organizational safeguards implemented? We can check things like that. We can give private rights of action to data subjects who end up being harmed, who come to find out that they've been re-identified, right? That there's only some sort of, we know to a relative degree of certainty that, this particular person was re-identified through this database, and we could, enable private subjects. But that's harder. I don't have an answer for that. So I'm sort of stuck there.
My name is Abhijit, and your last point, I think, was helpful to a degree, because I've been trying to get my head around re-identification. I'm quite confused, because on one hand, I think it is kind of a bodge because anonymization is not strong enough. It shouldn't be the reason. If I listen to a tape or a sound clip and identify that as Barack Obama,
right,
have I re-identified and broken the, or Donald Trump? So I'm unsure whether re-identification should be banned.
Right, or maybe we have a precise enough definition of re-identification to avoid things like listening to a tape and saying, I know that person, and maybe we put some sort of intent requirement, right, which is one of the
I don't know how much controls you're going to be able to add, because if you're talking about, fire and forget kind of data, should they be banned? what are you going to do with census data?
Well, right. So census data is hard. I mean, that's an incredibly difficult one. If a lot of it is we can try to identify questions that we know are basically re-identification type questions, and we say you have to avoid sort of intentionally seeking out someone's data, and this is where I look to industry standards. This is where we need the participation of computer scientists and the open data community and advocates working together to try to agree on a basically set list of principles. We were able to find, so privacy is probably one of the most intractable concepts that's ever been created, right? We've been writing about it for 1,000 years. Yet somehow, over the past 30 years or so, we've settled on a relatively set number of privacy principles, the fair information practices, right? Incredibly, this is sort of the universal language of privacy. And maybe we should try to seek to have a conversation where we try to find things that are universal, sort of problematic re-identification techniques. And if we can articulate those, then we can say stay away from those, and then the other stuff just sort of is collateral damage, right?
I know lots of people have their hands up. I'm looking at Phil because he told me about 10 minutes ago to wind up in 5 minutes.
I'm so sorry, guys.
Have I got time, Phil, to take like 3 questions at once and have that be Woodrow's wrap-up? So no? Okay. I'm really sorry,
I'm really sorry.
people.
Email me. I'm happy to answer any
or have a
questions
quick
afterwards.
chat after the class. After the class. Because after the lecture, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
a
It was a pleasure. I appreciate
thought-provoking, a passionate discussion today, including with the audience as well. There were lots of really interesting questions. Next week's lunchtime lecture actually is a wonderful lead-on from this. So I really hope many of you can be back, because next Friday's lunchtime lecture is titled "Who Owns Your Reviews Data? Your Reputation in a Digital World." It's looking at data portability, which is totally wrapped up in notions of data protection, as well as data rights under IP and database law, and portability, which is coming through in the GDPR and now potentially in the Free Flow of Data initiative. So it's a really good opportunity to continue the discussion. That will be a panel debate. So there'll be the Australian economist, Nicholas Gruen, the Assistant Director for the Department for Biz, or its new title, which I actually don't remember, Industry, Infrastructure, Energy, Tom Gerlard, and also hopefully somebody from Airbnb. So it should be very interesting. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Are you sticking around this afternoon?
Yeah, I wanted to stay for the event. I would love to